they're making their way will be in Acts, the 19th chapter. Acts chapter 19. We're in Acts, the 19th chapter. I'll also make two updates on three updates on those who have been sick. Ruby Speck said she was feeling significantly better when I spoke to her yesterday. Hope to go and get tested either today or tomorrow. And Lord willing, assuming that comes back negative, she said she looked forward to being able to be here with us. Jimmy has shown no signs or symptoms, which of course is great news. Renee had her test yesterday, and the doctor does believe that the results are going to be cancerous, so they are going to do a biopsy on that in the very near future. So we need to remember Renee and Dawn in our prayers. And then the third one is on Sharon and Michael Howard. Sharon is doing much better. Michael is also doing some better, but still has a little ways to go before completely well. That's all that I really have as far as updates on those. And also Raymond called Steve, and he seemed to be in very good spirits and seemed to be very hopeful as far as his health goes, and perhaps even being able to come home at some point. So our study this evening is in Acts, the 19th chapter. And if we remember, Paul has embarked on his third missionary journey. And as he's made his way through all of these cities, one by one, he has been strengthening and encouraging the churches that he had either helped establish in some part, maybe from the grassroots, from foundation up, or perhaps just plays an instrumental role in their daily lives in the work of the Lord's church there in some capacity. And so as he's making his way, leaving from Jerusalem on into Antioch, he goes from Antioch through the region of Galatia, on through Pisidia, on into the Asiatic area there to the far west side of Turkey on our map, if you're looking there in modern day times, but there on into Ephesus. Remember, on one of his journeys, he wanted to go down, on his second journey, he wanted to go down into Asia, and did the Spirit allow him to do that? Now, the Spirit prevented him at that time, but there would be some good that could come from that, and now the floor had been laid for him to enter in. And there'd been a man by the name of Apollos who had been there, who had been preaching and teaching, had taught the baptism of John, and there was a lot of good being done, but there was a more straight path, the more correct way, the accurate way that needed to be taught. And there was some correction there as far as John's baptism versus Jesus' baptism that had to be established for the people there in Ephesus. So we saw what happened there last week and how Paul would straighten out some of those things, and there would be people in Ephesus who would receive these spiritual gifts. Specifically, there were 12 that we know of who had these extraordinary abilities to be able to speak in tongues and to perform those signs in that fashion. And so there was a lot of good happening while there. However, despite some of the good that was taking place with the Apostle Paul and those men, there of course was there are some discouraging things that were still going on there as well. There were some people who were going to try to tarnish the name of the church or tarnish the name of Jesus the way, and so Paul would have to refute that and deal with that to a certain degree here this evening as we study tonight from verses about 21 through the end of the chapter. But before we got there, one of the miracles that the Apostle Paul had been doing was casting out demons. And these 7 sons of a man by the name of Sceva, or Skiva, depending on how you want to pronounce it, or maybe you want to make the C silent and just say it's Seva. Whatever you want to do there, that's fine with me. You have these guys, and they had been Jewish exorcists. And what were they doing, or what were they pretending to do, it seems? They were pretending, in part, casting out these demons. They had all these magic books to it. And they saw what was being done at the name of Jesus Christ, and they saw what was being done by Paul. And what did they do?
They tried to cast out the demons.
They tried to do it themselves in the same way, and it backfired. And it backfired big time on them. Remember, the demon itself speaks out to these guys. We know who Christ is. We know who Paul is. But who are you? That's a bit of a paraphrase of that. And what happens? That demon-possessed person, the person possessed with that evil spirit, whatever it was, then kind of attacks them, and then they're driven out. And so the books were burned, and we talked for just a moment about the astronomical amount of money that would have been when you look at the cost of these books and how it added up unto, what was the total number there? 50,000 pieces of silver, and how if it was 50,000 denarii, meaning 50,000 days' wages of silver like that, that would be $5.5 million in today's terms minimum. But if we're talking a talent piece, meaning like a year's wage, which could possibly be the case, because books were not cheap. Like they're not really cheap nowadays either, but they definitely weren't cheap back then to have printed out. And it would be likely it could cost up to a year's wage to have one book like that. And they're being burned, and that would, in today's money, $1.5 billion. A lot of money being poured out or just burned, literally there at that point. But why was it being burned? Why were they burning their books?
They were giving up to profession.
That's right. They were giving it up. The word of the Lord was growing, was maturing. It was prevailing within them. And they were giving up their deceit. They were giving up that thing that mattered so much to them. Sometimes we have to do that, don't we? Give up certain things. Give up certain distractions. Give up certain items that can hinder us on our walk. And so that's exactly what they did. Well, it was in verse 21 where we left off that after these things were finished, Paul purposed in the Spirit to go to Jerusalem, after he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia, saying, "After I've been there, I must also see Rome." And having sent into Macedonia 2 of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, he himself stayed in Asia for a while. So Paul, he has purposed in his heart, in his mind, in his spirit, as it says, to go where? Where is he wanting to go or needing to get back to?
Jerusalem, and from there he wants to go to Rome.
Yeah. So we kind of have right there the last outline of the remainder of the book. Paul's going to make his way back to Jerusalem till finally he's going to end up in Rome, and that's where we end the book of Acts later, several chapters later. So that's one of those outlines that he tells us, look, this is where he's wanting to go, and when we get there, we'll see that's where he ends up. But before doing that, before leaving, he sends off Timothy and Erastus. We don't know a lot about, we don't know a lot about Erastus. We know a little bit about Timothy. We've discussed him several times already. Why is he going to send these guys? Why is he going to send these guys ahead of him? Well, in 1 Corinthians 16, we know a little bit about what all was going on with Titus, and in 1 Corinthians 16 of how he's wanting to go on, make it back by Pentecost, or stay through in Ephesus through Pentecost. And we know Titus, how he couldn't find him there in Troas, and they were looking for him. And so there was a lot of little things like that coming up, and they're going to be going back and forth, carrying gifts for him. They're going to be carrying these letters. Most would agree that this is the time when he is going to write 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and they're going to receive that letter there in that Macedonia region and on into Achaia. And that's very likely that would happen. Why else is he going to send these two assistants of his, these two close companions of his on ahead? Well, why wouldn't he? Think about it like that. Why wouldn't he send them ahead? If he's going to be going into a specific area, he's got work to do. He needs the people to be prepared, to be ready for that work. Why wouldn't he send them on in, send them on ahead to get ready for the work at hand? Well, whatever be the case of their mission and their purpose, there arises a disturbance. My Bible calls it, there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. No small disturbance. What do you think that means? That probably means it's becoming a stir within the city, don't you think? About that time there occurred no small disturbance concerning the way. For a man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Artemis, Diana, was bringing no little business to the craftsmen. These he gathered together with the workmen of similar trades and said, Men, you know that our prosperity depends upon this business. You see and hear that not only in Ephesus, but in almost all of Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away a considerable number of people, saying that gods made with hands are no gods at all. Not only is there danger that this trade of ours fall into disrepute, but also that the temple of the great goddess Artemis be regarded as worthless, and that she whom all of Asia and the world worship will even be dethroned from her magnificence. So we see Diana, or Artemis, depending on your translation and what you're reading there. And we see this temple goddess, one who will be mentioned later on, depicted or sent to them directly by Zeus, he will call him out to say, as he gets a little more heated later on. And what is Demetrius's big deal here? Is his big deal really over the fact that these people are turning to the God of the Bible, to the Hebrew God, to Jesus? Is that his problem?
He wants to still sell his idols.
That's right.
That he made.
Yeah, he makes these little figurines, these statues, these shrines, and his income's getting hit a little bit. And he's a little sore over that. I think we mentioned last week in an introduction to the 19th chapter a little bit about how it's kind of like if we were to go to New York and we were to go to one of those gift shops in town. You're going to see a lot of stuff made to the Statue of Liberty in those gift shops. It's kind of like that, right? If you've been to see the Ark, you go inside the Ark, you go into the gift shop, guess what you're going to see? a lot of things that look like the ark that they want you to buy and take home with you. Well, it's just like that. These little shrines, these little items, these necklaces. I don't know if they were printing on any shirts at all. I doubt it, maybe. But most likely, they would have these pots. They'd have these little necklaces. They would have jewelry. They'd have stuff like that you would set up on your mantle and you would worship. Because after all, the temple of Diana, the temple of Artemis, was considered at least one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. You wanted to see it and you wanted to remember it. But that would mess you up if that was your line of work, to market that. And now here's this guy saying, you know, that goddess, she's a false god. Let me tell you about the one true God. And so Demetrius is not very happy. On more than one occasion in the book of Acts, when we look at that phrase concerning the way, talking about the way of Christ, it's often shortened to just the way. And so that's just one of those important things to remember as we go through there. So Artemis among the Greeks, Diana, according to the Romans, was the mother of the gods of men, according to their books. And so Demetrius, while trying to appeal to the masses, to appeal to the people by saying the welfare of our goddess, their goddess, that was not really his main concern. His real main concern, it seems to be, is rather the craftsmen and their business and how it was going to be suffering greatly. So, when they hear this, of course, rage comes over them. Their blood begins to boil. That's how we'd say that today. Our blood is boiling. And guess what happens? It's like a mob. Mob mentality, at least. They begin shouting and chanting, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." And the city fell into confusion. And they rushed in with one accord into the theater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. So I think this is one of the first times that we pick up on these guys. I know they're mentioned in 1 Corinthians as well. And this may be the same guy that's mentioned in one of John's letters to the beloved Gaius there. But we don't really know too terribly much about them other than they are his companions. And what happened to them? They were captured and drug out. What do you think they're going to do to them? Probably treat them like the other people that they've drug out into town, beat them some? Well, that might be what they were planning to do, but they're not going to be as successful as they have been at other times. At least not with these two guys. Thanks be to the town clerk a little bit later on. But let's see what else happens. In verse 30, when Paul wanted to go into the assembly, the disciples would not let him. I want to ask a question. Why wouldn't the disciples let him go into the assembly?
There was chaos and they didn't want him to get in the middle of it.
So we have the assembly there mentioned, a mob that's come together. It's the first time we see it here. not in reference to the church. And then we have an assembly mentioned later on where it's a legislative assembly at the end of this chapter, verse 39. And they don't want him to go in because his life could be in danger if he goes in there. He said it right. It was chaos. But Paul, he seems to be a kind of guy at times, even like Peter, he's got to run on in. I got to go in. I got to get in there. I got to be a part of this. Well, he's going to be held off from doing that. It's probably a good thing, right? Probably so. Some would say, well, this may be a part of God's providence with Paul. Maybe so. But let's see what else happens here. So then, some were shouting one thing and then some another, for the assembly was in great confusion, and the majority did not know for what reason they had come together. Isn't that how that usually works? People start arguing, they start fussing, and by the end of it, nobody really knows why they were fussing and arguing to begin with. Nobody can get their story straight.
Mom.
Oh yeah, all the time. I don't know how many Andy Griffith episodes where it's just like that, where he's always trying to stop a fight or a feud and no one knows whose side is the right side. It's the typical Hatfield and McCoy debate, and guess what? No one knows why they're mad anymore. Well, they can't figure it out, and so we keep reading in verse 33 that some of the crowd concluded that it was Alexander, since the Jews had put him forward, having motioned with his hand, and Alexander was intending to make a defense to the assembly. But when they recognized that he was a Jew, a single outcry arose unto them, and they all shouted for 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." Can you imagine? They're arguing. There's a guy, I can set it all straight. And then they realize, no, you're a Jew, and we at least know this much. It's about Diana. So let's just shout Diana for 2 hours. Can you imagine? I can't. I just find that so hard to imagine. But there's so much in this chapter, especially this from 21 on, that reminds me of the Andy Griffith Show and some of their squabbles that they have with the protests that take place on different occasions, and even with the city clerk and how he just wants to keep law and order and do things by the book, and we can make those relations over many a time like that and compare the two. But the people have lost their minds. They have all, it seemed, except save the city clerk and this man named Alexander, maybe a few others that they won't listen to, they've all lost their minds. They've become obnoxious. It's as if we go back to chapter 7 with Stephen, and when he makes his defense before the council, how did the council there respond to Stephen? They start foaming at the mouth. They're like dogs is how they're described, just slobbering, screaming, and shouting at him. That's what we're kind of seeing here. So let's look at the last bit of this chapter. After quietening the crowd, the town clerk comes in and speaks up and says, "Men of Ephesus, what man is there after all who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is guardian of the temple of the great Diana, and of the image which fell down from heaven. So since these are undeniable facts, you ought to keep calm and do nothing rash. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of our goddess. So then, if Demetrius and the craftsmen who are with him have a complaint against any man, the courts are in session and proconsuls are available. Let them bring charges against one another. But if you want anything beyond this, it shall be settled in the lawful assembly. For indeed we are now in danger of being accused of riot in connection with today's events, since there is no real cause for it. And in this connection we will be unable to account for this disorderly gathering. After saying this, he dismissed that assembly. Finally, someone level-headed came in and quieted things down. Notice how he appeals to them. One of the first things that he does, he says, look, don't you realize when it comes to the temple of the goddess Diana, it is known throughout the world? That's not going to change. And it didn't change until ultimately it's pretty much just destroyed and there's just minimal ruins left there in Ephesus today, and modern day Ephesus in the region of Turkey. Just minimal stuff left behind that we can see, depictions of those items. But in their time, was there going to be any real loss? No. So he appeals to them first from just the grandeur of the place that they are at. Even points that didn't this image, where did this image come from? Where does he say the image came from?
Fell from heaven.
Fell from the heavens. One translation says came from Zeus, meaning fell from heaven. So you have that idea there. It's not going to change. The sensibility of this man is like Gamaliel's was back when he is dealing with Peter and John, and he tells the other Jews, have nothing to do with them. Don't you remember those guys that started a stir and then they fizzled out? Well, if this isn't true, then it's going to fizzle out. But if it's of God, can we stop it? No, Gamaliel will tell you no. If it is of God, you cannot stop it. In fact, he even emphasizes how it would be wrong to try to stop it if it was of God. Well, I kind of hear that kind of appeal to them, to this people. A different side of it, completely secular, but he appeals to them first in that way.
He's just appealing to them to, if you got anything against these people, do it legally in the court of law.
Oh, yeah.
Instead of mob rule.
And he's going to get on to them about that here in just a moment. Now, before he does that, he then brings up the facts about Paul and his companions. And the facts were, these guys have done absolutely nothing wrong. They haven't even blasphemed the names of these gods. They're not even blasphemers of our, quote, goddess. They haven't robbed the temples. They've done nothing wrong. Now that's a good commendation of Paul and the companions there of the way. They're not trashing these people's beliefs. It seems perhaps more so they're going to ignore it to a certain degree. Just teach them the truth. Teach them about the true God. And then we get to Demetrius. He says, if you've got real charges, well, the courts are in session. We can go file the appropriate paperwork today. But if not, and and all you're going to do is just stand around screaming? Well, know this. You're liable to the courts if that keeps up. Because you have now been issued basically a citation, a warning of disorderly assembly. You could turn that whole chapter nearly into a 20-minute Andy Griffith special, couldn't you? Pretty much. But what do you see take place? The sensibility of one man within that town to calm things down, maybe for his own good, for the good of Ephesus. But if we look at it and ask the question, why is this story in our Bibles? And we ought to do that when we read our Bibles. Ask the question, why is this here? There's a reason it's there. And we need to search for the why. Why are these stories there? They're there for a purpose. God gave them to us for us to learn something from them. And sometimes those things are, He can use these people to bring about His will. Don't you think a great cry, a great stir within the mighty city of Ephesus, don't you think that's going to make the local paper? Probably. That's going to ring out a good ways. And that can be a good thing as far as the spread of the gospel will go later on. So after all that was said, he dismisses that assembly. The uproar ceases, and it seems the people dispel and go about their separate ways for a little bit of time. What other thoughts might we have up to that verse at the end of chapter 19? Or what other questions or comments might we want to make? I don't think we have time really to go into chapter 20 tonight. We are right at the time that we usually would break. So, let's see, do I have anything else written down? Nope. Well, let me ask this. Where does he go next? From Ephesus, where does he go? You have to read on into the very next verse, into chapter 20, and he's just going to make his way on up into Macedonia. And we know from other writings, he would go from Troas on into Macedonia. And so we're going to take note of that, from Troas to Miletus, and then back into Ephesus. And he's going to spend some more time with the brethren in Ephesus until finally he goes home to Jerusalem for the final events of what we will record as the final events of his life there in those last, 8 chapters or so that are remaining. All right, well, we'll break for just a few moments then until the other classes come back in, and then we'll resume at that appropriate time. Thank you for taking part in our study tonight. And I'll turn this off now, and we'll just wait for everyone to come back in.